This is presentation number 8, Medieval to the Renaissance, Dark into Light, incorporating line, outline, contour, implied, and expressive. In this slide presentation, we are going to explore the art of the medieval era or period through to the Renaissance. But we're also going to explore simultaneously the varieties of line, and these include outline, contour, and implied. So very simply, outline refers to, and it's where you can find the most outline, is in Byzantine art. We're going to look at portrait images of the divine. We're going to look at faces, tradition, symbology, and flat interior space. Contour line takes us into the medieval period. We have the early Christian, Romanesque, and Gothic, and we see draperies and simple perspective. And lastly, implied line takes us into the Renaissance, where we see representations of reality, rationalism, and perspective. But first, let's just remember the elements of art, knowing that line is one of the 7. And there are many, many types of lines, as we discussed previously. And that line is the foundation of all drawing, but it incorporates a lot of other information for the other visual elements. So line in an artwork can be used in many, many different ways. It can be used to suggest shape, pattern, form, structure, growth, depth, distance, rhythm, movement, and a range of emotions. So here we have outline. Simply put, outline emphasizes the edge. And it's a flat, two-dimensional thing. Contour line also expresses edges, but it can do so in a spatial, illusory fashion. Implied line is where you cannot see the line, but your eye knows that it's there. So as an example of a contour line, we're looking at the image of a hand. You can see the photograph at the bottom, and you can see the outline of the shape that the edges of the hand make. And then we see the contour line, which shows us the areas which change the plane within the object or the form, like the inner seams within the structure of a shoe, for example. The term contour finds its origins in French and is derived from the Italian term contorno, to round off. Here we're looking for edges. And in this picture by Pablo Picasso of Igor Stravinsky, this is a blind contour drawing, as discussed earlier. So the artist has looked for the edges of the shapes without looking carefully enough to make it realistic. In other words, that the artist is not really paying attention to trying to draw exactly what they see, but more get a feeling for it. Now, the difference between defined lines and implied lines is with a defined line, you can see it, and an implied line, you can't. So simply speaking, the apple on the left, the outline, the defined line, you can see all the way around the outside. The implied line in the one on the right means it's still there. The edge of the apple is still there, but it's not defined by a line. And line can have so many expressive qualities. In this print by Kathy Kollwitz, who is a German artist who made a multitude of extraordinary prints and expressive drawings of poverty and pain. We can see the way that the lines are used increase the impression of the intensity of the emotion in this picture. So, how did the use of line change as artists developed their ideas and their desires to make their art look realistic? In this presentation, we're going to consider the uses of line during a critical period in art, the medieval to the Renaissance. This is a 900-year period which encompasses and shows the development of art from flat linear images to fully illusionistic, realistic representations. And we also see the effects of geography, history, politics, and patronage. Icon to portrait, a journey. So here we are. We are in the Byzantine era. There are three main areas to this era. There is the early, middle, and late Byzantine, starting at 330, roughly around circa 330, and stretching right up to 1453, which is into the Middle Ages. Early Byzantine has a very strong emphasis on the outline. In this image, we see Christ as Pantocrator, meaning almighty and all-powerful. He's holding a book. He has a golden halo, and he has a kind of Middle Eastern aspect to him. His face is elongated, and you can see his hand is held in the position of blessing. So when we think of early Byzantine art, we think of mysticism, repetition of form, gold leaf, richness, symbolism, the expressions of power, and flat interior spaces, and above all, outline. Faces, tradition, symbology, and flat interior space. Here we have another image of Christ, Pantocrator, and he is in almost an identical position. He's holding the book in his left hand, so scriptures. He has his hand in this same position in his right hand, and we have the golden halo, the extended face, the beard, the very flat background with the patterning, and all these elements are very stylistically related to the Byzantine. We also see outlines. Here's another one. This one is Middle Byzantine from roughly 1000 AD, and we see that this is nearly identical to the icon from 3000 years earlier. So the Middle Byzantine followed a period of crisis for the arts called the iconoclastic controversy. This was a period where the use of religious images was hotly contested. When we think back to the concept in Islamic art that the image of a person or of God is not acceptable, the iconoclasts were worried that the use of images was idolatrous, that the attempt to represent the divine was a very bad thing to do. So they destroyed images, and they left very few images from the early Byzantine. So we have here an image which shows us a mosaic icon. So an icon is an object or an image of devotion, usually a painting. And this is mid-12th century, and it's extremely small, but it was made that way so that it could be carried as a votive object. These votive objects were extremely important to Byzantine Christians. They felt them to be expressive of the silence of God, of exhibiting the ineffability of a mystery that transcends being. Without speech, they praise the goodness of God in that venerable and thrice illumined melody of theology. This is a quote from Nicephorus. The late Byzantine takes us up to the time when the Crusaders from Western Europe had invaded and captured Constantinople, and they temporarily toppled the empire in an attempt to bring the Eastern Empire back into the fold of Western Christendom. So by this point, Christianity had divided into two distinct camps. There was Eastern or Orthodox Christianity in the Byzantine Empire, and the Western or Latin Christianity in the European West, which then based itself in Rome. At this time, there was a beginning of an interest in space and depth. The images from this time become more three-dimensional, and the lines become softer, moving toward contour-type lines, implying spatial qualities. So even in this image of a crusader, who's in fact killing a dragon, so an image of George and the dragon, we see the flat golden background. We see a linear flat quality, but we also begin to see some of the draperies and the lines in the draperies becoming more indicative of space, and we see the blending and the value in the horse really starting to make it look three-dimensional. In this slide, we see an image of Mary on the golden background with the symbolic placement of the hands, with the golden halo, and yet her face is becoming much more realistic. One of the interesting things about this period of time in art is that we can see a great deal of affinity between modern graphic design and the Byzantine art. Like modern graphic design, Byzantine art's main concern was to convey its message to its audience in the most effective and efficient way. The Byzantine artist used various signs, stylized images, and calligraphy to convey the messages of their faith. We can analyze 900 years of medieval art by examining decorations inside churches and how human forms of images such as the Madonna and baby Jesus evolve from large heads on small bodies in early Christianity to abstract forms in the Romanesque era. In the Gothic era, The Madonna and Child are more naturalistic, with tall, bony figures. Even the facial features of the Madonna and Child changed over 900 years. By the Gothic era in France, Mary had an approachable, warm countenance, signalling the Church's recognition that the images should attract people instead of intimidating them. In the Renaissance, artists would become bolder about exploring the themes of Christianity, even in works commissioned by the Church. So moving into the medieval period, this period spans the time from the fall of the Roman Empire in 300 AD to the beginning of the Renaissance in 1400 AD. The Middle Ages, art evolves as humans continue to address the traditional and the new, including biblical subjects, Christian dogma, and classical mythology. Again, there are three main medieval periods: early, Romanesque, and Gothic. Now, the medieval period was also known as the Dark Ages. And as we'll see when we move into the Renaissance, that the word Renaissance or Renaissance means rebirth. So these periods had some very specific visual iconography. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church financed many projects, and the oldest examples of Christian art survive in the Roman catacombs or burial crypts beneath the city. By 350 AD, the Church had two power centers, as we mentioned earlier: Rome in the west and Constantinople, which remained the capital of the Byzantine Empire in the east. The cult of relics became a defining feature rooted in the first centuries of Christianity. Fragments of martyrs came to be honored as objects of power and as a way of knowing the divine. By the High Middle Ages, the treasuries of churches and cathedrals were filled with precious reliquaries, objects of devotion so powerful that pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to venerate them. Despite widespread destruction during times of war and Reformation, body part reliquaries are among the most important containers for the remains of holy persons to have survived to the present. These devotional objects were understood to direct the prayers of the faithful to that saint in heaven for their intercession. These heads and busts therefore carried intrinsic power. In addition, the finest head reliquaries rank amongst the most important sculptures and goldsmiths' work of their time. So here we see a golden reliquary. And it's interesting to see, as we look at medieval art, that there is a continuing focus on the head. And one of the things that repeats itself in medieval iconography is the importance of the head as a center of power. In the same way that a reliquary contains this intrinsic power, the head is seen through that 900 years is seen to be an extremely important symbol. Here we see an example of that. This is a head of Christ from the late 15th to the early 16th century. It's made in North Brabant in the Netherlands. So it's limestone, and there are traces of wood, which would have been the thorns in the crown of Christ. Portraiture, sculpting the identity in Roman art, gave a legacy of true portraiture to the Middle Ages. Few sculpted heads of the Middle Ages were portraits in the modern sense. The reasons for representing the human face were far more various than recording the physical likeness of an individual. So during the High Middle Ages, portraiture did not rely on likenesses so much as attributes or symbols, such as coats of arms, inscriptions, and other identifying signs. We can think of the medieval cathedral as a stone Bible. In the medieval time, almost nobody could read. Books were transcribed in monasteries. And the only way that the average person could understand the stories from the Bible was to see the scriptures in images. So, what scripture is to the educated, images are to the ignorant. They read in them what they cannot read in books. This was a declaration made by the church. So, enormous amounts of money and patronage funded the building of enormous cathedrals. And so their function was to lead the faithful toward contemplation of God. The stone figures served the uneducated, the majority of the population, who knew only the vernacular language and nothing of the official Latin of the church. And as such, these visible images represented an invisible truth. It was such an understanding of the nature and value of representation that led to the profusion of images in the Middle Ages. Here we have the arch above the doorway at Chartres Cathedral in Paris, and we see the zodiac, the signs and the monthly labors. And this is one of the things that we see again and again in medieval art. We see the everyday culture of the quote-unquote educated, uneducated people, and it's being transposed and combined into Christianity so that people can relate to it personally. Here's another tympanum, and this is from an abbey in the southern area of France called the Moissac. And we see here again the same images. We see the apostles, which are represented as in their animal form, which actually relates to the zodiac. Another form of art in the Middle Ages is the illuminated manuscript. This manuscript represents the beheading of Saint Paul and is dated to roughly 1300. Often these illustrations were in the choir books, which were completed alongside a cathedral. And the medium is tempera and ink on parchment. Parchment could have been animal hide, or it could have been a carefully made, thick kind of paper. As we discussed in a previous presentation, the one of the things that allowed the Roman style of architecture, which had the arches that we see going all the way back to ancient architectural styles, we see these Romanesque or Roman-like arches transfiguring into the Gothic flying buttress. And these buttresses were the engineering marvel of the Middle Ages. And they allowed the churches to soar upward. When we look at oil painting from the 1400s, we're seeing Northern Renaissance painting. This particular painting, the Arnolfini portrait, or the Marriage of the Arnolfini, was painted by Jan van Eyck, who most likely studied under his brother Herbert van Eyck. And the pair worked for Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. So this artwork it represents several things. It represents an extraordinary change from the flat Byzantine art that we looked at earlier. We see here represented a plethora of conventions which create depth and space and very realistic and representational imagery. We also see ordinary people. These are not poor people, they are wealthy, but they are not heads of state, they are not religious subjects, they are merchants. And this, we know a little bit about the history, and Arnolfini, who is the man, is becoming betrothed to his wife-to-be. And the symbolism, we see many forms of symbolism here, the way his hand is raised, the way she has her hand over her belly. No, she is not pregnant. It was considered a sign of beauty to have this swollen belly. It was symbolic of fertility, as is the color green. And so here we have this fertile, beautiful young woman being betrothed. He is showing their connection and the ownership, if you like, of her. And in the mirror in the distance, in the back, we actually see a tiny upside down image of the couple from the other side. So this is really where Jan van Eyck is showing off his skill. And that's the way he would have got his commissions and made his money. So one of the very, very famous works from this period was actually painted by Jan van Eyck, and it is known as the Ghent altarpiece. We've seen this image in a previous slide. For about 1,000 years, Europe lay in the Dark Ages under a feudal society without any significant signs of advancement. The Black Plague also happened during this time. Sometime in the 14th century, in Europe, serfs began to live as free men, and the printing press was invented. So communication became a thing. Commerce started to take off, and new ideas arose and were spread. With this mobility, the rise of the merchant class led to an increase in ideas, philosophy, artistic advancements, and scientific innovations. Old religious ideas were beginning to change again, and the Reformation started to take over in the north of Europe. So the Reformation was the move away from Catholicism. In Italy, the Renaissance in architecture and sculpture had already taken off with innovations made by Donatello and Brunelleschi. So, if we want to understand the way in which northern art developed as opposed to southern art, we must appreciate the infinite care and patience with which Jan van Eyck created the Ghent altarpiece. It consists of 24 panels in total. 12 are visible when it is open, since it has wooden doors to protect it, and 12 are visible when it's closed. It portrays the story of Christian faith, owing largely to a passage from the book of Revelations, St. John. Here is a close-up of the image of the face of Christ. And here we see the Byzantine image of the Christ becoming utterly realistic, with the use of oil paint and the skills of using line and shape and depth in completely new ways. We can see that the hand is coming forward. It's in front of the body of the Christ. We can see the details in his eyes, his eyelashes, his beard. He looks utterly realistic. His pearl-encrusted garments shine, and the gold in the patterning behind him has a sense of light and dark, which creates space. The closed altarpiece consists of 3 rows. On the top 2, sibyls or angels are flanked by 2 Old Testament prophets. They're watching the heralding of the Annunciation from above. In the middle row, Archangel Gabriel delivers the news of Jesus' birth to Mary on the right. Her answer is written upside down, as God would be looking from the heavens. The panel in the middle row depicts both the sanctuary for the Holy Eucharist and a royal hall. Christ could be represented by the open space in the middle. The bottom row depicts John the Baptist, center left, holding a lamb, and John the Evangelist, center right, holding a chalice. The 2 figures surrounding them are the donors, Jus Vijt and Elisabeth Borlut, who are painted in red to depict them as living. So these images are packed with symbolism and iconography. And the primary aim of the artist is to create realistic images that bring these ideas and stories to life. Fully opened up, the Ghent altarpiece, we see a crown lying at the feet of Christ with an inscription on the base of his throne. Placing the crown before his feet is probably used to depict him as the King of Kings. The inscription reads, on his head, life without death. On his brow, youth without age. On his right, joy without sadness. On his left, security without fear. This quote is in the style of the Franciscan model of God as the benevolent Father, and is referencing the difference from the medieval and vengeful God of the Dark Ages. Behind God, we see small designs in the shape of pelicans. In Gothic tradition, the pelican was thought to pick its flesh to feed its young in time of hunger. This is symbolic because God sent down his own flesh and his Son, Jesus, to save us. On either side of God is John the Baptist and the Virgin. The Virgin Mary also has a crown, which most likely represents the Church and the marriage between God and the Church. To the sides of the figures are angels playing music. Outside, on the top row, we see Adam and Eve, representing proto-human beings and original sin. Adam and Eve are shown here as realistic images, which makes this painting extremely unique. Above them are depictions of Cain and Abel. The top row is dominated by the central figure of God, and the lower half is dominated by probably the most famous painting in the altarpiece, the Adoration of the Lamb by all the saints. The center panel shows the sacrifice of the Lamb of God as a symbol for Christ. The background is the same landscape in all of the lower panels and creates a continuity across the entire image. We see tall mystical buildings which probably represent a heavenly Jerusalem. Closest to the viewer are two processions. The group on the left consists of patriarchs and prophets from the Old Testament, and the group on the right, the New Testament, deacons, bishops, and other persons representing the church. We also see the confessors of the faith, and on the right, another group representing the Virgin Mary. In the center before the Lamb, angels kneel with symbols from Christ's passion, his suffering, but the Lamb feels no pain because it is no longer bound to this earth. The Lamb's blood flows from his chest into a chalice. So this work attracts, there we have a description that is literally just the description, and it is so complex in terms of its iconography and symbolism that it takes a long time to describe all the small pieces which make up the whole. There is a little debate concerning the authenticity of this painting, but we do know that Jan van Eyck was responsible for the Annunciation and probably almost all of the inside panel. This altarpiece is gigantic, and we see the exploration of perspective, which is the major change in art that we see as we go from the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, through to the Renaissance. The use of oils allowed the artist to add much greater detail, such as the jewels and the musical angels. Oil paint is very flexible and allows subtle gradations of light and shade. The oil paints also allow a heightened palette with rich and often brilliant colors. This overall technique was called a New Realism, which distinguished the Northern European Renaissance from the Southern. Another very important feature that we see in the Renaissance, which is where we are now, is the use of light. So shading and value, and then the adding of precise detail, create an enormous amount of realism. We see the light being cast from the windows, and it gives the scene a soft, realistic aspect. The use of perspective is key, and the artist transforms his figures in this image through careful attention to detail. And the images get smaller in the distance, and we see the use of one-point perspective in the bottom panel. Van Eyck had a very intense adherence to detail, but not in a mathematical and exact way, which we see in some of the Italian Renaissance painters. He painted the figures spatially correct, but he did not idealize them as the ancient Greeks or Romans might have done. His attention to detail goes down to the description of metals, reflections in mirrors, suits of armor, and inscriptions. And we see this more and more in Northern realism. We see this attention to detail, and particularly to surfaces. Finally, let's have a quick look at the donors. As discussed previously, these two were depicted at the very bottom. They were the ones who paid for this enormous and extremely expensive artwork, and in their devotion expected to find favor when they died. So here we have another image that just shows us the flat, golden, linear kind of painting with some interesting use of scale. In other words, the Christ child looks like a tiny adult. He doesn't have a bigger head. And these kinds of conventions we have seen, just to conclude, we've seen them from the very early Byzantine right up to the mid-medieval period. So this is Duccio on the left. And on the right, we see Giotto. And Giotto was a famous fresco artist who painted in the Sistine Chapel. And we start to see, this is a flattened image as well. And it's typical of the early Renaissance. So moving into the Renaissance, we're going to start seeing two very important things. We're going to see the use of perspective. We're going to see the use of more implied line. And we're going to see, especially in the use of linear perspective, and we're going to see the use of looking back to antiquity, in other words, to the works of Roman and Greek artists who worked so hard to create realism. This work of art is by the painter Masaccio, and he developed the use of single point perspective. And we can see here a very carefully, mathematically worked out grid in the barrel arch above the crucified Christ. So using this geometry, it's actually possible to work backwards to accurately measure and reconstruct the three-dimensional space that Masaccio depicts. Masaccio was one of the very first people in Southern Europe to use linear perspective to recreate a 3D image on a 2D surface. Filippo Brunelleschi was an extremely talented draftsman, and he used a very important experiment which was based on careful mathematical calculation. And this is where perspective becomes solidified as a technique. We see on the left a drawing of his, which we then can transpose exactly to the actual Church of Spirito Santo in Florence, which was built in between 1434 and 1482. So he used these drawings to show his clients how it would look after it was built. And it's very clear to see how effective this new technique of mathematical perspective was in depicting the spatial reality. This painting here is by Leonardo da Vinci. It is The Last Supper. We're going to look at this as an example of implied line. We're going to look at how perspective, single point perspective, is easily seen, how it creates emphasis and dominance within the image, and how those lines, those structural lines, are implied. In other words, they are invisible. So if we look at the tops of these, I'm not quite sure what they are actually, these areas which look like perhaps tapestries on the walls, or doorways, or windows. They can't be windows, they must be doorways or tapestries. But the tops of those lead the eye back into the distance. Now we look at the mathematical representation of that. So here we have single point perspective. It's very, very simply done. It's very dramatic in the way that it works. And we can see that the single point is actually placed very specifically on Christ's head to create Christ as the center of the painting. He is the subject and the most important element in terms of this narrative. So these lines are here within the painting, but we know they're there, but we cannot see them. So that makes them implied line. So this breakthrough of perspective as implied line is the number one thing that created the possibility for artists to make extremely realistic representations of space in the Renaissance. From here, it became a question of more and more complexity of how to create the illusion of depth. Andrea Mantegna was a high Renaissance Italian painter, and he studied Roman archaeology. You can see here his paintings of putti, which are the little naked children with wings, who are famously from symbols and icons from the Roman era. He was experimenting here with perspective by lowering the horizon in order to create a sense of greater monumentality. His flinty metallic landscapes and somewhat stony figures give evidence of a fundamentally sculptural approach to painting. But his main legacy here is considered the introduction of spatial illusionism. So in the Renaissance, we've talked about the breakthrough created by implied line as linear perspective. But another thing that was combined with that was the breakthrough of creating images of the human body which were exceptionally realistic and well proportioned. Leonardo da Vinci was a master of this, and one of the reasons why was that he studied anatomy, including studies of anatomical dissections, and it gave him the means to recreate three-dimensional physical reality of the human form on a two-dimensional surface. So the underlying structure, the hidden structure of the human body being properly understood in terms of proportion was what enabled our artists to produce super realistic renditions of what they saw onto the flat surfaces of a wall in the case of frescoes, or onto a wooden panel, or onto paper in the case of drawings and paintings. Artists in the early 15th century had learned to portray the human form with faithful accuracy through careful observation and anatomical dissection. We've seen this image before. We know that it's a silver point, and I put it in here to include the expressive qualities of line. We've talked about the different types of line: outline, contour line, and implied line. And in the Byzantine, we saw a lot of outline, mostly. In the middle to the high medieval time, we saw contour line. In other words, lines that create some depth through draperies or a sense of a line moving backward or forward in space. And then finally, we see implied line in the Renaissance in the form of perspective. Now, implied line doesn't have to be just perspective, but that's what we see the most. What we haven't looked at yet is expressive line. And we can also see here in this drawing evidence of implied line in a realistic drawing as well. In this study of arms and hands from 1474, the focus is on the hands, the light is on the hands. The artist is interested in discovering more about the hands and how they can be portrayed so that they look real. This drawing has become about the process of both seeing and drawing. And this is something that we see in contemporary art, because contemporary art is primarily about process and not product. And in this way, the work of Leonardo is timeless. So how did the use of line change as artists developed their ideas and desire to make their art look realistic? In this Laocoon group, which is from the 1st century, it's a Roman sculpture copied from a Greek original dating from the 2nd century BC, we see several things. We see a form of neo-classicism, or we see classicism in the fact that it's a Roman sculpture copied from a Greek. We see the way that the lines in the sculpture, we see everything here, essentially. We see implied line, we see outline, we see contour line, and we see expressive line. So perhaps one of the reasons why it was considered such a successful sculpture is that the combination of all these types of line combined with form and space and light and value and texture. In fact, we have all the elements of art here, and it creates drama and movement. This sculpture is of David, out of the story David and Goliath, and it was created by Michelangelo Buonarroti, the Italian Renaissance sculptor. This is a high Renaissance sculpture. It is over life size, it is 17 feet tall, and we see here the classicism very clearly. We see idealized proportions. If you look closely, you'll see that the head is actually quite a lot bigger than it might actually be, and the hands also. We also see implied line. In the left image, we can see the veins on the arm carefully depicted, but there's no edges there. It's a implied and contour line. And the last image, two images, are show us expressive line in sculpture. This sculpture is by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and he was a Roman sculptor. This is called Damned Soul. And it is a virtuoso study in expression, using marble, but also if we can also analyze the lines and the way he's used the lines in this sculpture. I'm showing these because we're leading into the next period of art, which is called Baroque. And Bernini was a master of the Baroque. So we see here in this extraordinary sculpture the heavy, solid material of stone created to look as light as air. We see leaves which are thin and breakable. We see movement. We see a sense of the wind, the speed at which these figures are in motion. There's a sense of instability versus the solidity of Michelangelo's David. So we can analyze the lines here, but we can also see how the Baroque moves into virtuoso descriptions of realistic images.